Hello, everyone, and welcome to this IANA webinar, Improving Visibility Across the Intermodal Supply Chain. I'm excited to have this session today. Before we get going, I want to thank our year-long sponsors. We are honoring our Platinum Plus sponsors for this session. They've made this possible, along with a lot of other educational offerings that IANA has. So we thank them. They really help us out. So we just want to make sure that they get recognized. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Doug Hine for a brief introduction for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Doug Hine, the Executive Vice President of Milestone Equipment Holdings and member of IANA's Board of Directors. On behalf of my colleagues at the 65+ Milestone locations across the country, I would like to welcome you to this IANA webcast, Improving Visibility Across the Intermodal Supply Chain, part of IANA's The Business of Intermodal Continues program. We have a terrific session lined up for you today on visibility. Some call it the Holy Grail for shippers as they ask the fundamental question, where is my shipment? Our panel will dig into what visibility means for the industry and where it's going. Hal Pollard, IANA's Director of Education, will be joined by today's moderator, Bill Cassidy, Senior Editor for the Journal of Commerce. Bill will lead a discussion with a tremendous panel of industry leaders, including a 3PL, a systems integrator, and a technology provider. This should be a great session. Now I'll turn it over to Bill to get us started.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome everyone. I'm Bill Cassidy, Senior Editor at the Journal of Commerce, covering trucking and logistics and intermodal and technology and many other things. So I'm very happy to be here today, thanks to IANA. We have a great panel today. I want to introduce our participants and have them say a bit. So I'm going to just name them first, and then I'll go to them and ask for some more information. Al Tama, Vice President and General Manager of Container and Port Solutions for Orbcom. Eric Klein, CEO and co-founder of Crux Systems. And Scott Friesen, Senior Vice President of Strategic Analytics at Echo Global Logistics. So I love when Doug said visibility has been the holy grail for logistics managers. You know, the Holy Grail, if you remember, was really hard for Arthur and his knights to get a hold of. Visibility seems to be a hard thing to obtain as well. In the past few years, however, advances in technology, especially greater use of application programming interfaces or APIs, have really given U.S. goods shippers the capability to directly track shipments moving by several modes of transportation in near real time. Shippers increasingly, it seems to me, are moving the goalposts when it comes to what visibility is and what they want. It's not just necessary to say where a shipment is or was a few hours ago, which would have been fine maybe 10 years ago, but where it is now in near real time and when it will arrive. And then it's a question of what do we do with that information when we have it. So I want to start out by asking our panelists to tell us a bit about themselves, their business, and why they think visibility has become increasingly important, not just to intermodal shippers, but shippers in general. And, Al, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks, Bill. I am Al Tama, and I'm a GM at Orbcom for Container and Port Solutions. Orbcom offers many different, solutions to the world, quite frankly. But for this audience, I'd say our primary responsibility is to take assets that are generally dark, dumb, and disconnected and make them smart. And so, how do we make them smart? We put a piece of technology in there, a modem, and basically allow them to, connect to the cloud. That inherently makes them visible, and that starts to generate data in an automated fashion, which of course can be consumed by many different individuals across the supply chain. So adds tremendous value. Why is it so important today? We're talking here about an intermodal context. I think to me personally, intermodal means, basically the supply chain globally, not just limited to the US, containers that move overseas, through the international supply chain, I think are the same that we focus here on the US. And that's essentially what my business focuses on. And I think, from the international point of view, I think that's one of the reasons why it's challenging. You have these massive companies with ownership stakes in these containers in particular, and so providing connectivity to those assets, I think, is a challenge logistically. But that being said, there are many data points that I think can be provided throughout the supply chain. So I'm not sure how much you wanted to hear from me, Bill, to start off. I'll just wrap up to give the other guys a chance to start. I'd say I'm about 20 years into this business in the supply chain, in particular, international shipping, and my particular focus and passion is around reefer containers and their related assets. I'll just pause there. Thanks, Bill.
Well, that's great, Al, and it's great perspective. And I think an important point to stress there is that when it comes to intermodal transportation, we're not just talking about tracking one container or trailer in, say, a point A to point B, very definite move. We're tracking a container that's moving from a ship to a port, to a rail yard, on a chassis, on a train, on a chassis again, and eventually to a close to final destination. So it's a more complex challenge than, say, simply tracking a truckload of freight moving from Idaho to Alabama. In any case, let's move on. I want to go to Eric and ask you the same question. Tell us a bit about yourself, your company, and why you think visibility has become increasingly important.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I've been operating in kind of the marine terminal and port space, both from a terminal operator perspective and from a technology vendor for, close to 25 years now. And when I founded Crux Systems, I was really much focused on how can we improve the flow of cargo, the velocity of cargo through terminals. And in that, we recognized that visibility was kind of the core problem that had to be solved in order to be able to improve that velocity. And so, 6 years ago, when we started out on this journey, through the connections I had with terminals, we kind of cracked that problem of, how do we gain access? How do we normalize the data? And essentially provide a common API that provided, essentially one source of truth for all cargo coming into North America. Well, what we found in that journey is, while we would like to have universal visibility across, all intermodal aspects in the world, it's a massive problem. And we really just stayed very much focused on just, continuing to improve North America. And in October of last year, we actually joined forces with Flexport, where they're looking at, the entire supply chain from shippers, consignees, air, parcel tracking, and with Crux Systems staying independent. We are staying very much, laser focused on just what can we do in the intermodal supply chain, and how do we keep improving from the export side of the equation, from rail cargo, and helping truckers, engage with that data. So as I joked, you boil the ocean one pot at a time. We're staying just in the intermodal space because it's big enough in its own venue. But visibility is definitely more than just an ocean container. I'll leave it at that.
Great. That's great, and I love boil the ocean one pot at a time. So, Scott, we'll move on to you on Echo Global Logistics.
Yeah, Echo is a third-party logistics transportation brokerage, and we're multimodal. So we're moving, LTL, truckload, intermodal, and my perspective. So I'm the relative novice in this space. I've only been in transportation now for about 5 years, which compared to so many people I meet, like Al and Eric, makes me a tiny baby of experience in this space. But I've been in the analytics space for longer than that, and spent a lot of my career in retail, actually. And I ran analytics for Best Buy globally. And I think that's one of the things that definitely informs my perspective on this topic. I actually have a theory that a lot of what's driving the B2B space and the demand for transparency and visibility is actually coming from the B2C space on the consumer side. And the fact that on Monday night this week, I ordered Thai food for my family from Plus or Minus.
You appear to be having a bad connection or a weak connection from Scott.
Sorry about that, guys. Looks like I lost a little connectivity there.
We lost you for a few moments, but you've been talking about ordering Thai food.
Yeah, ordering Thai food, and I promise it's relevant. I didn't just have a cerebral event. No, my point is that apps like Domino's Pizza app and Grubhub and DoorDash, they can provide those updates. And so when you're dealing with a $30 dinner order and you're saying, I know exactly where my dinner is all the time, to me, it's a very natural extension for an executive of a shipper, that VP of supply chain to say, wait a minute, I've got a $30,000 container here and I don't know where it is. And not only, my dinner, I know when it's arriving within 10 minutes, I'm not even sure I know what day it's definitively going to arrive, so it just feels like a real cognitive dissonance. And so I believe that's one of the big driving factors for actually what's going on in B2B, because companies like Amazon and others have set a completely new bar of expectations. And I think that that's drifted over and translating in the B2B space.
Right. I received 3 packages this morning. I knew they're going to arrive this morning between a certain period of time. They got here, no problem. I got a photo, and I'm actually sitting close to where they arrived, but I got a photo showing me they had arrived. Kind of experience definitely is reshaping expectations and has been doing so for a while. But I wanted to ask you all what is probably it seems like an obvious question, but I think it's one that's worth discussing. And that is, how do we define visibility today? How is the definition changing for us? Does it mean the same thing it meant 10 years ago or even 5 years ago?
Yeah, I can jump in first, Bill, if you like. I think in some ways the answer is it of course does mean the same thing, because you want to know where your asset is, your shipment is, of course, at its base. And when you don't have visibility, right, when you're in a dark spot, that's really the most important thing you're looking for. Well, any type of information, and location is the simplest. When you do have the technology and the right integrations of data sources, then visibility becomes a much more advanced definition. And that's when, it's not just the data that of where it is, but then it's the algorithms and the artificial intelligence and the machine learning, the layering of different data points that give you something more comprehensive, such as, estimated arrival times or reasons for the delay of the shipment and things of that nature.
Right.
It's like a layer of fidelity. I think back even in the 90s with EDI, you'd say we had pretty good visibility from a carrier standpoint of saying, oh, I know my cargo is on a ship, or I know my cargo is in the port of Rotterdam. But today, we want to know the precise location within a marine terminal. We don't want to just know that it's at Long Beach container terminals in LA. So it's this fidelity that has also evolved over time. But it's the same definition. Where is my stuff? What's happening to it?
Right, but just more detail, as you're saying, more fidelity. Mm-hmm. High fidelity now, if you remember.
Yes. Yeah.
And,
and 4K to 8K.
So it's not just enough to know it's in LA or it's in Houston. You have to know exactly where within that port complex this will be, down at the terminal and lot level. And, Scott, I wanted to ask you what you might add to that in your view as to how the definition is changing. And
yeah, I think, it's funny because I think of it a lot along the spectrum of trust. Don Tapscott has referred to the blockchain as the trust protocol, the idea that I can trust this information because of how it's stored, how it's captured and stored. And I think about that also related to all these visibility issues. So for decades, maybe a century, over a century, transportation and shipping has been a relationship business. People always talk about it being a relationship business. So you could ask a very simple question, which is, why is that true? Why is it a relationship business? And my answer to that is because you're entrusting critical elements of your business into the hands of some third party or set of third parties. And what we see as an evolution across lots of spaces is moving some of that trust from people and institutions into technology protocols. And I view a lot of this tracking and the level of specificity that Al and Eric are describing, which I think is exactly trust.
We've lost you again, unfortunately, Scott. But I think what you're going to there is visibility implies the need for a level of trust, knowing that something will arrive, knowing where it is. That also implies a level of comfort. Let's see if we can get Scott back here momentarily. But I think there were 3 things to emphasize for the audience there. One is the need for increased amounts of data, as you mentioned, Al, that go along with where the shipment is, where the asset is. the level of detail as to where that asset is, not just in a general sense, but very specifically what port terminal it is in, what lot the container is in, what train it's on. And then third, I think the ability to gain from this information a level of trust and a level of comfort in knowing that this is where it's supposed to be. This is going to be here when I expect it to be here. It's more important perhaps than people think and realize, that level of comfort that can come to us from having that trust.
Well, if I could add,
I think that's absolutely right. And, ultimately, it's going to become about more than.
I mean, I think that trust is also a statement about the number of parties that are trying to get that data. Where, again, getting your drayage carriers, your customs brokers, your forwarders, all of these different entities that are all helping to coordinate or have the needs for engagement on that shipment from origin to destination. We've kind of always known the quantity of those parties, where is it upwards of like 10 or 15 different parties or even more. So that trust goes into all of these different parties needing to get access to the same information, to be operating on the same page. Whereas, before, some would be highly connected, but most of it was just that trust. It was word of mouth. It was like, oh, I knew I could figure out where my shipment was because I could call Joe, and Joe would tell me, it's on its way. Don't worry about it. It's going to get there. And I could just trust that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd say too, as you mentioned, we're dealing with multiple parties in an intermodal move. However we define that intermodal move.
Mm-hmm.
We carrier, we have the port, the container terminal, we've got a drayage driver, we've got inland warehouse, you got the intermodal marketing company, you've got the railroad, drayage carriers again, maybe chassis pool. So a lot of different players involved in this, unlike say if you're moving freight via a truckload carrier again, or an LTL carrier, it's going to be moving from point A to B in the hands of one company. So the need for trust and verification becomes even greater, I would think, in the intramodal sector as we try and gain visibility.
Yeah, I think another point that came out there, Bill, which is important, is with all the different parties that are involved, the same piece of data can be relevant to all those parties, but in a different way, right? It's the same piece of data, but it's able to be used, for scheduling, for preparedness, for efficiencies across the operation. And, it can essentially be the same data point. So keeping that data siloed to just one party therein shows kind of the weakness of the data, when it only becomes its most powerful when it's actually shared, because so many people can glean benefits from, essentially the same data point.
Mm-hmm. Scott, I understand that you're still with us, just not on camera right now.
That's right. I've got a weaker internet, so I'm just trying to stay with you from audio standpoint.
Well, we'll keep going. And one thing I had wanted to ask was, and I think we've already hit on this, and you'll have some insight into this, Scott, as well, because Echo works with truckload, works with LTL, works with intermodal. What makes getting visibility in the intermodal segment so difficult compared to other segments? We've mentioned just now the multiplicity of parties that are involved in any intermodal move. But are there any other issues in addition to that that we could look at?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think eventually this stuff has got to connect to warehouses. We talk about the different parties and the movement of the goods. The full supply chain isn't only about the movement. It's also about the storage, the housing, the organization. And one of the things we talked about the other day is, the nirvana state is that you have predictive algorithms anticipating the time and location and the odds of delay in a given location at a given time, all the way down to the individual bay doors. And one of the things that I think we're not ready for yet universally is, dynamic allocation of warehouse resources, whether those are forklifts or caddies to move things along, the staffing, et cetera. But you can imagine a future in which you have predictive algorithms anticipating when different shipments are coming into a location, and then dynamically allocating what door or what parking position, if it's a chassis or what have you, right?
Right, and where that's going to end up. And with that, of course, you've got a better capability to manage the outgoing capacity you're going to need when that shipment is turned around and is ready to go on to the final destination.
So yeah, I think we heard about delay there in the middle, and I think I agree with what Scott's saying, right? Having the ability to use that data after just the location. But when I think of as I said, I focus a lot on reefer, both on the container and over the road space. Part of visibility, like you talked about, is not just a location. So in that case, it's also the temperature, right? And is the load okay, right? And if you're dealing with a perishable good, especially one that's coming by a container overseas, a delay can mean that even with controlled atmosphere these days, a significant delay can still mean that the perishable goods are at risk, or perhaps their shelf life won't be as long as it should be or was anticipated to be. So having as much notification and visibility of that delay then can create decisions down the supply chain. So for example, I'm going to sell this piece of produce at a discount because it's not going to last very long and I have to move it. You can do a kind of first in, first out type of preparation, because once again, the shelf life is very short. And so those are kind of those dynamic, near real-time decisions that could be made with that kind of information that I think we couldn't do yesterday. And hopefully we can get to the point where that's just part of, normal everyday life in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. What needs to be done to introduce this level of dynamism into these technologies and these systems? Does this require artificial intelligence? Is it something that requires other development? Eric, if I could throw that one.
Yeah. There is definitely a play where AI becomes relevant. I mean, we're using some machine learning and AI algorithms regarding some of our on-time performance, but in order for those, that kind of higher level intelligence, you need a lot of data. You really have to, and not just data meaning, I'd like to get all cargo, let's say, coming through the Port of LA and Long Beach. You also need duration of data. We need to be able to look at patterns, not over just months, but over years. And so, those are really great optimizations that people are working on, and we're going to get there. But what's the short-term stuff that we can work on that helps either feed the data into those algorithms or just help solve short-term issues regarding, just what's happening right now? Because what I would add is we see that over the journey of a cargo, not just where it's at, it tends to hit these choke points where it kind of goes into a planning black hole. So I might know from factory to warehouse what my normal transit time, let's say, is between those two, origin and destination. But when it hits transshipment hubs, when it hits a rail yard, when it hits a marine, the next thing you know, you might have a dwell time between 1 and 14 days. I mean, the range can be dramatic. And that's a question of planning information. That's still an area where we don't really have good info. What could be shared either by the terminal or the railroad or the carrier, but there is a missing piece there that would improve on-time performance greatly.
I just wanted to combine what Eric and Al had said on two different topics. Al talked a little bit about the notion of fidelity. He talked about the idea that the specificity of location data is getting, finer and finer grained. Okay, and what I'd say is, building on what Eric said, at the AI end of the spectrum in terms of predictive analytics and dynamic optimization, then you have to have huge volumes of data at a very fine grain. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some materially useful things that can be done with just better base information. If you just had complete, even if it weren't as granular, you could develop simpler
algorithms
that are still wildly beneficial.
So we don't need to develop necessarily the HAL 2000 of intermodal visibility in order to get the job done.
There's a lot of value to be created between, nothing and the HAL 2000.
Right. So in terms of problems with intermodal visibility, and I think we've hinted at this too, where do you see the major pain points being, or the points where the intermodal supply chain becomes less transparent and more opaque? Is it the terminals? Is it the rail yards, warehouses, the dray carrier?
So if I can answer that, because I think we see two key problem areas right now. One is at port of origin and rolled cargo. You get your cargo to the terminal, and then it becomes, is my cargo going to load the ship or not? And that's an area where there is still very poor information regarding why is my cargo rolled, or is my cargo going to get rolled? And this has huge impacts, both for terminals from a congestion standpoint, because they might not want cargo at those origin locations based on their anticipated rolling schedule. But then on destination, it is loading out on trains. It's that major variability on, is it going to load a train to Chicago? Is it going to be tomorrow, or is it going to be a week from now? And it becomes this black hole of planning information, frankly. Those are our two big areas.
Yeah, and I like, again, your emphasis on planning information, because it seems that we've heard for years that, the data is as important as the shipment, and not just the data about the shipment, but the planning data, the operational data that into making a movement possible also has to be part of this mix. Part of, like, if we have several layers of data, that has to be one of them. Correct. And I think it's also fair to point out that this isn't just a transportation problem. It's an inventory management issue at the heart of it. And right now, that is, again, becoming more and more of a critical area for many BCOs as they're dealing with inventory shortages and efforts to bring more goods in from Asia and the West Coast very quickly. So once again, ability becomes critical there.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a practical example. I mean, I can't speak to the scale of it, but we hear of this scenario enough to know that it's not that rare. But a container, arriving in LA that's going to go to Chicago via rail, and that customer has an expectation of, I expect it to get there, within 3 or 4 days. But then it sits in LA for another day and another day and another day. Well, is it going to load the train or not? And the tactical thing that happens is, like, well, if you knew it would load out late, then I'm going to actually go and dray the container directly from LA or transload it out of LA and then get it on a truck out to Chicago. And that kind of inability to get that information creates just essentially a gridlock regarding how can we take action on this. So that container just sits in that terminal, and the customer is just frustrated at the end of the day. So I don't know how common that is, but we hear it enough to know it's not rare.
Alice?
I would say, from my perspective, what I hear from customers in the same type of scenario that Eric just described is they believe in many of those cases that the data actually exists. It's just that they don't have access to it. It's not being shared. It's in, let's say, the terminal operating system or some other system like that. And they just want that data to be exposed. And I think that's a key point, the sharing of data, the trust, like that was discussed earlier. It's important because historically there has been some reticence to share too much data because it might expose maybe, let's say, some dirty laundry. But the problem is that also has consequences, like Eric described. And at the end of the day, the person who owns the beneficial cargo owner, who counts on the arrival of that shipment, really is impacted because of the reluctance to open up the data, if you will. And that's what I advocate for strongly. It's of course there might be some not so pleasant things that get exposed from time to time, but the value is really there for the entire supply chain when the data is made available.
Great.
Al, you're completely right on that. And I just want to point out that if you think about the entire supply chain similar to sort of a Kanban efficient lean manufacturing operation, right? Essentially every step has a downstream customer. Its totality depends on each step serving its downstream customer all the way down the line to the end. So it's not good enough to just only be thinking of the next consignee, but rather that consignee's consignee, right?
I find
that's the way we actually get to holistically improve supply chain.
Right. That's a great point. For those who didn't hear all of what Scott had to say, Scott, let me just try and sum. You're talking about in the supply chain, really, the process really is more like a just-in-time manufacturing process where you have things that are done at every single step. and you have to have not just on the next step, but that door-to-door move, that final step. We all hear people want door-to-door moves and the ability to track things door-to-door. So within Intermodal, we're constantly looking at, well, the drayage driver is concerned about getting to from the container terminal to pick up a container and getting it to either the railhead or to an inland warehouse. And that's
exactly right.
Destination, but there's more need to tie all that together. Well, here's a question there. I mean, what do we need to do that? How do we bring these intermodal links that are separate to an extent together from an overall planning perspective, from an execution perspective?
I'll give it a stab. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the market needs to demand it. And I don't think that they have not been. I'm not sure what the tipping point is. You know, in some ways, I would say that, you know, if I look at the asset side, many of those assets aren't generating data automatically. And I think that, you know, would also help if the data is there. You know, we talk about, well, I got the data, now what do I do with it? I think in some cases, you know, the data just isn't there. It's analog or just not available. But yeah, then beyond that, so I think that will help, you know, grease the wheels. I think beyond that, then it's about the market demanding it. And I think, you know, Eric might be able to weigh in there more as kind of like the being in between those data points. But I know there's you know, as I mentioned before, that reluctance of sharing that exists today too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. There are certain assets that just have almost no visibility. I mean, chassis is to me a perfect example of, you know, yes, if you're managing your chassis fleet, I think even that party will say they struggle with understanding where their assets really are. So that would be one area to really, you know, get more exposure to. But I would say the sharing and the interoperability of this data, you know, it's gotten a lot better. I mean, where I started out 6 years ago, you know, you're effectively your only option was to screen scrape data off of websites, and the access through APIs has improved dramatically. And I really see like we're finally getting a culture shift. I mean, we've been talking about the need for a culture shift, and the companies that get it are, you know, making the right kind of strides of providing access however they want to provide access. I mean, that's always been our mantra. Is we say we don't care how you do it, just make the effort to provide access, and let companies like Crux and others, you know, figure out how to bridge that access among all the parties. So that's happening, and I think, you know, you're either in one boat or the other. The boat that gets it are going to be the successful companies. The ones that want to keep fighting it, I think, are just going to become, you know, they're going to be obsolete. Is the reality of the matter.
Can I add on to that a little bit, Bill? Just one great point that Eric made that I think is relevant is, you know, he mentioned the, you know, kind of the common data sets or, you know, unified data model or, you know, the standard APIs. And I do echo that. I think that's a very key component, you know, to making the data, you know, easily shareable, because it's easier to be consumed, right? You don't have to put the integration effort in there when you don't have those kind of standards. And what I will say is, from where I sit, there are numerous efforts going on, starting up at the shipper level, but also by independent bodies like the UN CFAC, for example, or the DCSA, or, you know, we talked about blockchain. There are numerous initiatives to do just that. So when we talk about, you know, the future is coming quickly, I think we're getting there. And whereas the global shippers have been maybe one of the obstacles, if you will, if I could put it nicely, because they haven't cooperated in this manner, I think they are now undertaking that initiative, and so are very large influential bodies like the UN. So I feel like that's coming, you know, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Scott, are you with us, and can you comment?
I can. I am with you. Hopefully I can comment. I completely echo those. And those are actually reasons why ECHO participates in BIDA and the BIDA Standards Council. Blockchain is not a panacea, but since there are now new communication standards evolving, we want to encourage a unified approach, because essentially we've all lived through the pain of EDI, different standards, and all of the tech teams that have to be hired and maintained in order to just translate that communication. If we could get on the same page in terms of the data protocols and the interoperability, the efficiency impact for every company on this front would be tremendous. So it's definitely something that we try to encourage and advance and want to see happen, because it's just going to make everyone's life a heck of a lot easier.
So what I've heard so far is that on a global scale, we have multiple partners, a multiplicity of partners engaged in the intermodal movement. We have a lot of new technology coming on, but we need to have, if not one standard, at least standards, which allow for interoperability and sharing, the sharing of data that will make visibility possible. Sharing is not something that we always talk a lot about in transportation circles. Sharing of data can be very controversial, especially if some data is part of their, let's say, secret sauce as to their own corporate success. But this really does seem to me as if we are talking about an ongoing culture change, which maybe is being accelerated now by new technology and by new demands.
Yeah, I think you were spot on there, Bill. You can, even within those standards, have the data defined as to what is your secret sauce that you hold back, and maybe it doesn't get as widely shared as other relevant points. But to use ORBCOMM as an example, the way that I would advocate for it to work is that data that's getting generated off of our assets is very easily available and consumed by Crux, and by Echo, and that it then goes down to their end customers. And so basically, we're the tip of the spear to providing that visibility and a little bit of the glue that holds it together. But all three parties benefit from it, as well as all of our customers and down the chain.
By the way, give a shout out to ORBCOMM. I totally agree. Their data is super easy to access and very easy to integrate with. So there's some stuff our guys have worked with you guys on, and it's been some phenomenal stuff that we've been able to do with it. So,
well, thank you, Eric. We're big fans of Crux too.
Well, I think an interesting point there too is, does this data increasingly, you mentioned that your systems automatically generate the data that's needed to track the assets. So it's actually the data is being pushed out from the asset or the shipment itself and then flows into the pathways that are set up for it as we go from one party to another. I mean, are we seeing much more automation, and will this in itself help us improve the visibility in the intermodal sector?
Yeah, I think so, Bill. To my 2 cents, I think once the APIs are there and once they're kind of turned on at the different connection points, then the data flows automatically, and that speed, right? That's the difference between analog and digital. And so, as I said, once the data gets out there, then I think you start having more people more parties that want to integrate too, and so it ends up being propagated even further. So yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's really it. I mean, I think to get to what does interoperability, what does the use of APIs mean to the common user? And I think, in the old EDI world, which is still super common, the barrier of like getting yourself set up as a partner, getting the initial integration, like it is still a significant lift. And really what interoperability does is, you go into your platform and you see, that partner company's logo, and you click on it and you put in a username and password, and all the data just starts flowing, right? I mean, that is really what interoperability drives, and that's starting to happen. And I, definitely in a few more years, that is going to be far more common for people to start sharing data and collaborating with all of their different vendors.
We've been talking about tracking of assets, tracking of shipments, but there's also, and we could talk about tracking of assets, we could be talking about that container, that chassis, that trailer, that truck, all of these elements which are not the shipment, but which contain the shipment at some point or another, or convey it. Right now, obviously, finding chassis, finding containers is a real problem. We've heard about a lot of containers being held because warehouse storage space isn't available. So containers aren't getting back into the mix, going back toward the ports. At what point does this become, the tracking of that asset itself as opposed to the shipment, become important? Are these two different things? How do they meld together?
They're overlapping. It's a Venn diagram, Bill. So there's times when tracking the asset is the same as tracking the shipment, and there's times when it's not, right? So when the container is on the chassis, then the chassis is part of the shipment. When the container's not on the chassis, then you're tracking the equipment, not the shipment. And to me, eventually this giant optimization problem to be solved of all these different moving parts requires visibility to all the component pieces.
All the component pieces. And I think that's really critical, especially as we get into a situation as we're seeing today where post-COVID-19, well, it's not post-COVID-19, excuse me. We are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're still seeing disruption from the pandemic. We're seeing lockdowns in Europe again and some countries in Asia. So supply is uncertain. And, what we saw happen certainly in the spring and into the summer was that assets were dislocated and it was hard to put them back together again into the puzzle, so that they fit together as they did before the pandemic and recession, leading to shortages of capacity, to higher costs, the whole shebang. We all know about this. I was going to ask, how COVID-19 has changed the need for visibility. I gave a partial answer just there, but gentlemen, if you could talk about that for a minute or two, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start, Bill. I think you actually answered it quite well yourself there. If anything, the lack of visibility was just kind of accentuated by the situation we've been here in COVID-19. I guess the interesting point is where visibility would help greatly, something like COVID-19. Sometimes there are some things that you certainly can't plan for. So I think, using the like containers, for example, there's a big boon in building new containers now, and the reason why is because you just can't get them out of where they're located, and there isn't enough time to relocate them to meet the need of the shipments because of the backlogs that have been caused by COVID. So visibility is good in that case, but I don't know that it could have changed it much. Perhaps it could have if we had planned for it 2 months ago. So I guess that's a little bit theoretical. But at the end of the day, I guess it has really just accentuated kind of the areas where there is a lack of visibility when we can't have physical feet on the ground. To provide those various pieces of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole pandemic, in my mind, just heightened the issues of the different constraints that service providers have from asset providers, and the lack of visibility just amplified anxiety. If you're an asset holder and suddenly you don't know whether you're going to have any cargo because the trade lanes on Trans-Pacific eastbound are shutting down. Suddenly you're in a panic, and visibility gives you that comfort of being able to communicate with the various service providers to know, oh, okay, well, PPE is obviously coming up, and the PPE providers are needing to find capacity to get those goods out. And so, visibility is what kind of tampons down the anxiety and allows the right services and the right assets to come together and say, all right, this is, now we're moving from PPE, it'll pretty quickly be like, vaccines. I mean, I don't think any vaccines traveling in any ocean containers. Surprisingly enough, a lot of PPE did come in via ocean cargo. There's some big problems still.
There's probably not going to be enough air belly capacity to handle the amount of vaccine that will have to be moved once we have a vaccine. So it'll be quite interesting to see where the spillover takes place. Is it into ocean containers? Most likely some of it will be. It'll be into tractor trailers at some point. I can see it also, once again, though, that's going to be an expedited movement, perhaps. If we're moving it in bulk, I would say a lot. It's probably going to take up some intermodal capacity. So that should be another challenge. For anybody shipping anything else next year, if we do have that vaccine when we hope to, sometime mid next year, there's going to be a big push on capacity and the need for capacity.
I'd also add this, because I think we tend to talk about the fear and the problems, but looking back over this, I actually think it shows how incredibly robust and capable the intermodal supply chain really is. I mean, the fact that ports stayed open, truckers still got the cargo out, ships were still sailing. I mean, there's by no means been perfect, but by and large, it has been very functional throughout all of this, and I mean, it probably has offset well that consumer demand has stayed as strong as it has. But I also think it's something to be pretty impressed by. I'm personally impressed by how well the intermodal supply chain is performed throughout all of this.
Well, that's great. Well, gentlemen, if we could go to Hal for some questions from the audience. I believe we have a few minutes left.
Hey, everybody. Thank you very much. That was a a great conversation. My apologies to everybody. I know that the technology's plaguing us all, but the good news is we've got a lot of folks with some great questions. To start out, Eric, thank you for mentioning that. I think it's really important. We got 3 actors right here that I know have worked really hard through the pandemic to make sure that customers' goods made it to the place they were going to on time. And I think that's echoed across a lot of the intermodal supply chain in particular. So thanks for calling that out, because I think it's important for us to recognize the fact at the end of the day, the intermodal supply chain really rolled up their sleeves and got a heck of a lot done in a very challenging time. One of the first questions is, how do we start to pull those elements of the Venn diagram that Scott mentioned together to get a better focus for all the participants in the supply chain?
To me, the collaboration starts with focusing on the customer and working back from there. So in terms of where to focus on the Venn diagram, it's about the shipment, and what you get de facto from the shipment is some of the equipment visibility, right? Not all of the equipment visibility, but everyone's aligned on servicing the end customer. That should be a unifying theme that should help with collaboration, and automatically starts producing a set of data that's not all of the data you want, but is a pretty big chunk of the data you want. So to me, that's the first part. And then you start adding on additional non-shipment equipment IoT kind of tracking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's there's not an answer, it's a combination, as I think Scott just mentioned. You need IoT devices to generate data from the assets. You need standards to make the integration and sharing of data simple. And then of course you need the trust factor that we talked about at the beginning to share that data. And of course it's fine to hold back your secret sauce. That's really what you need.
Great feedback. This one gets back to the notion of interchange standards. You mentioned a few efforts to collaboratively create some standards. How is that going? And then the other piece is, what are the missing parts, the quality of the data? So not necessarily where it's coming from, but its actual inherent quality. Like, are people minding their P's and Q's to make sure that the right data goes in the right field?
Well, what I can answer on that, I mean, I would always say the first part is participation, and I'm not going to say one standard over another is the right answer. I think wade into this by taking a step to see whether it's the DCSA or you name it, participate. But I think everybody kind of knows their own state of, like, it either is a messy world that they currently operate in, or maybe a little bit afraid. They might not even have the capabilities themselves, and companies like what we're doing at Crux is to helping bridge that. So we can apply the standard and we integrate with the standard and then distribute the data through standardized formats. But if the party we're integrating with can't support that, we can be that bridge. So I think even if you can't conform to the standard, there's tools like what we offer, and we're not the only company that does it, that can help bridge the divide with a given standard. So number one is just participate.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I'd say, in order to answer kind of the state of it, you see, if we talk about the DCSA, they published 2 sets of standards, if I'm not mistaken, at least 2, let's say, this past year, with more coming in a continuous fashion. Same thing with the UNC FACT publishing track and trace standards, for some assets, and continuing to do so. So I think we're making progress. And then, also kind of to echo what Eric said, so some of the standards are now published. Now they have to be implemented. So yeah, people need to start dipping their toe in or wading into the ocean of data.
Great. Thanks, guys. Here's one, and they say, a question to consider. How do we handle uncontrolled disruptions like weather, labor disputes, etc.? Is there a way to maybe turn that from a challenge for visibility into maybe a way that the visibility network, we'll call it, can help solve for some of that, or at least give some better information about it?
Yeah, I think we're doing a bit of that today, at Orbcom and other companies, overlaying, weather maps, for example, in terms of like where your assets are and where they're traveling, and trying to, apply those algorithms when you're talking about estimated time of arrival, vis-a-vis weather. And when there's, disruptions at a port like Montreal or, other places, where they're strictly shut down, looking where cargo and freight are being redirected to, and then taking that into the same type of a consideration when it comes to, okay, how does that affect, the delivery times there? So the good news there is I think some of that's actually already happening. I'm sure it could continue to get better with more data and more advanced learning, but I think to a degree it's happening today.
I'd agree.
One thing, Hal, if I could chip in there, I think is part of the solution is the culture change or shift we talked about earlier on. It's no longer enough to simply say, this is the way we've always done this. These are the people I've always talked to. We need to look beyond that and be able to be more, I hate to use the word agile, but to be more agile, to be more flexible, because we're not going to see any reduction in volatility in the future. I mean, eventually we will have a vaccine for COVID-19, but we're likely to see other pandemics in the future too. We're going to continue to see natural disasters. We'll continue to see economic volatility as we, come out of this recession and hopefully back into another extended period of prosperity. But I think that because of the complex nature of our business, of supply chains, we're going to just have to be ready to think in new ways and shift in order to adjust to circumstances.
I think you're spot on. And I think, I see we're a little bit over the top of the hour, so that's probably a really good note to leave it on. I'd like to thank you all for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I can't help but feel like this is sort of a way station on this conversation, and I'd love to be able to maybe come back in a while and maybe regroup and see where we are. We definitely have got a lot of unanswered questions. Again, thank you for your time. I just wanted to let folks know if they're interested in other sessions that we are doing. We've got several more before the end of the year. That information is available at intermodal.org, our website. Just go to the Business of Intermodal Continues program or look for the education link. Or you can send an email to info@intermodal.org. And again, thanks to our year-long sponsors, particularly the Platinum Plus sponsors who made this session possible, as well as some other educational opportunities that we've done throughout the year. Just want to give them a nod and a special thanks for everything that they've done. So with that, I will say thank you, gentlemen, for your time, for your energies. Keep up the good work in keeping the supply chain going and as visible as possible, because you're all doing a great job in that regard. Bill, keep the great writing going, because I know everybody loves to see it. And everyone, thank you for your time. Stay safe out there. Wear your mask, wash your hands, keep an appropriate distance from one another, but keep doing what you do.